G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. And in this video, I'm going to show you how you can turn a sketch like this into something like this. Alright, so you may be wondering whether or not that video you just saw was 2D, 3D, or a combination of both. And in actual fact, every element you saw in that video was a 3D model. The only reason it looks kind of like a painting is down to the way that I textured it and the method in which I did it. And that method is known as projection map texturing. Now, this method is nothing new. It's been around for decades. It's even been used in The Matrix. It's been used in Arcane. It's used in all kinds of productions. But there's not many videos out there on how to actually achieve the look that I got in this video. And it's actually pretty simple. It basically involves having a fixed camera in your scene. You project your UV maps against that camera and then export those UV maps out to Photoshop or any other painting software to be painted. And then you bring in those painted textures or painted layers into Blender or whatever 3D software you're using, and then just basically reproject them onto your models. It's a pretty simple process. Surprisingly little information about it online, but I want to shed some light on it today, and hopefully you'll gain something useful out of it. So let's just jump right in and have a look. All right, so we are actually in the file that I've shown in the preview video. So I thought I'd work backwards in this one and show you how the finished result looks. So you can see here we have our scene fully modeled, completely ready to roll. The camera is in place as I matched it to my sketch. And as you can see, it is fully 3D. And it's quite a large scene as well, but I have a few key models here for the foreground. I got a bunch of duplicates in the scene as well. And then we have our feature down the end there with the building and these sort of fake mountains. If you go over here and have a look, you'll see that the mountains are actually just sort of like modified planes. There's a few things you should note though, is that every object is not an instance. Once you've instanced them all out, you need to apply the instances as real physical objects in order to be able to do this method. And if I turn it on now, you'll see with all the lighting and all the glory and all that sort of stuff, how it looks. And you can see here right now, it kind of looks correct. It all looks really, really good. Everything is where it's meant to go. There's shadows, you know, from the single light source that I've added to the scene. But if we now pull away, you'll see that the actual textures are pretty much unusable outside of that specific angle of view. That's really important to note because you're basically drawing in context to the camera. You're texturing in context to the camera. So for instance, if I look at this tree and I go around the back of it or go to the side of it, you'll see that the textures are stretching. And if you look at the desert plain, all those cracks in the soil are just stretching along the horizon. Yeah, it's really artificial in terms of what we're looking at here. Yeah, but yeah, what you get as a result is something that looks really, really directed, I guess you can say, individual, painted, designed, anything you want to call it. It's all there. Now, if you want to learn or see the process on how I created the entire scene, such as the environment, maybe the ship, the smoke, feel free to check out my sister channel, Dicko Grande, in which I will be publishing more longer form videos. That way, if you want to find out a little bit more information, you can check out that channel. If you're looking for a bit of a taster, this is the channel for you, so everyone can be happy. So the method in which to get the scene ready is pretty straightforward. Basically, we just have to select everything in the scene and then project our UV maps against the camera that we have in the scene, which has been locked off. We export out those as separate individual layers to be used in Photoshop. We paint everything up in Photoshop. We then export out those layers back out of Photoshop into Blender and then attach it to any material that you like, whether it's an emission shader, a PBR shader, or a custom shader of your own. You can use it in any circumstance. It's up to you. All right, so here's an example of how the file looked before I started doing all the texturing. So what I had done is made sure that all the different elements had their own material. Now, I've just used an emission shader to help me distinguish between the bunch of different shaders, the different materials that I need to sort of texture on. But it could be any material. It doesn't have to be anything. As long as it's been assigned a material, it doesn't matter if it's an emission, a PBR, yeah, it doesn't matter. All right. As long as you've got one assigned to it. Okay. So what you want to do is make sure that every element that you think needs to be painted together has its material attached to it. So for instance, the sky has a material. Each individual tree that I have in the foreground has a material to it, but every tree in the background is assigned to the same material. Now, the camera, you need to be locked. You have to make sure that when you're using the camera here, that you've decided on your composition. You've decided on where the elements are being featured, what you want to have on the, within the different compositional elements of the shot. Maybe you want to break it up into thirds, maybe you want symmetry, maybe you want golden ratio, maybe you want all that sort of shit. It doesn't matter, but as long as you've locked it down and you're happy with that shot, then you're good. All right, cool. The next thing is pretty straightforward. Is just to projection map your texture map. Now, I will also say that your camera, anything behind the camera, you shouldn't really have anything behind the camera in the shot. So you can see everything is in front of wherever the film back is. So wherever the pivot point is of that camera, there's nothing really behind it because it still projection maps behind the camera, which is kind of crazy. So again, make sure that everything you have is within the view of the camera. All right. Once you've done that, select everything, or you may have to select everything individually depending on how high poly your scene is or how slow your computer is. I'm just going to select everything. Go into tab, into edit mode, let it think, and you'll see that we now have everything editable in view. What I'm going to do now is push A on my keyboard to select everything in the scene. Let's just swap over to the UV editor to see how this looks at the moment. Right now, it's a complete mess. All the elements are just nowhere in the view of that resolution there. So what I'm going to do now is just push U, project from view, let it think. You'll see that everything that is visible in the camera is visible there, but it also extends beyond the bounds of the texture map as well. So you can see still some elements that I could delete, but I'm not going to bother. But yeah, anything that's in that shot, you'll be able to export out to Photoshop. All right, cool. That's it. That's the UV mapping complete. Really simple, really straightforward, and yeah, you're good to go. Good to go from there on in. Okay, the next thing we need to do is actually export out these materials as individual layers. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because if you were to just export this out as an image and then sort of just paint around the edges of whatever the shapes are and all that sort of thing, you are still going to be projecting whatever you texture on this tree will be projected onto the ground behind it. So that becomes problematic if you do want to add a little bit of parallax to the shot. So if you want to have the camera move in a little bit or slightly rotate left or right, you want to be able to not have that happen. You want to have that, you want to be able to, so let me just show you what I mean. If I want to do this, for instance, and the camera's been project mapped in a certain way, you will end up seeing the tree projected on the dirt. But if you export out these as different layers, you can effectively paint behind the tree. So that's what we're going to do here. So I fucked up the camera there. Let's undo that. Hopefully that works. There we go. That's better. So once you've got that established, all good. So now what we need to do is set up our renders to render out basically render passes of each collection that contains the objects that have the right materials. But what I recommend is just going into the compositor. And what you want to do next is to set up a set of view layers where each collection is turned on individually. So basically the mountain's turned on individually and everything else is turned off. Mountain 2 turned on, everything else turned off. Ground turned on, everything else is turned off. And then what you can do is basically set up these render layers for export. All right, so we have all these different render layers here with the right scene. You can see here that we have plants, foreground, rocks foreground, sky, rocks, etc. And then you create a file output node. Create a file output node and then go to the tool options. Where are we? Node, settings, properties. There we go. And basically set up a set of output nodes. So you can do that by pushing add input and just type in every sort of collection name that you have in your collections here. And then what you need to do is match the names to your view layers. So what we're going to do here, let me just turn off all this crap, is set up your outputs. So master goes to master, mountain 1 goes to mountain 1, mountain 2 goes to mountain 2. And what this will do is basically send out a rendered image of every pass as a PNG with alpha channel. So you want to have RGB enabled here and the file format set to PNG. And that will basically allow us, it's essentially creating a mask for us that we can use in Photoshop. So once we've done that, make sure you have a base path to set this out. So you can see here that I have a bunch of textured an output to go to my textures. And what I need to do now is essentially set up my rendered resolution. In my case, I went with like a 6K resolution. You can go with something lower, 4K, 2K, whatever you need. But once you've done that, you're ready to push render. And what we'll do is just basically render the same image over and over and over again and export out a series of render passes. And they should look a little bit like these. So let's open up these ones here. It will look like this basically, alpha mapped, alpha channeled images. Just like that. And once you got that all sorted and it looks like this, we can start to bring those into Photoshop and basically reconstruct the scene. Now you might be wondering what exactly are the advantages of going down this route. Well, the first one is obvious. It just looks cool. You get to add your own personal touch to the entire environment. It gives it a nice painterly, individualistic feel to it. You're animating or you're texturing to the shot, which is also really cool. And you are able to break a few rules, like lighting rules, compositional rules. You'll be able to be a bit more abstract with the way you do your textures, which is really cool. Obviously, there are some disadvantages to this method, which include, obviously, you aren't able to really move the camera all that much because you're projecting the texture on a very specific angle of the camera. If you do any crazy camera sweeps, you are going to basically essentially break the shot. The textures will be stretching along certain elements or overlapping other elements, which can cause a few issues. But that being said, if you have a pretty solid storyboard and you've set up all your stuff beforehand, so you've got your composition up and running, you're happy with the shot, and you're not planning on really moving the camera, then this is an awesome method. The other cool thing is that you can bring the scene to life through other means, such as animating characters, animating vehicles, or environmental elements. And you can see a little bit of that in the final video that I posted at the start of this tutorial, which included a little bit of dust spray with grease pencil, the spaceship landing, camera shake, very subtle, but enough to bring home the whole idea. So that's where you would add life to the shot. Not necessarily through the camera 100%, but you rely more on character-driven moments, action moments, that sort of stuff within the scene. All right, so we're in Photoshop now, and as you can see, I've brought in all my layers and I've chucked them into the appropriate stack. Now, the way you go about painting these layers is really up to you, but what I like to do is use clipping mask layers instead of painting on those render layers directly. That way I can use the render layers as clipping masks, which allow me to sort of not worry about painting over the edges of every single layer. If you are using Photoshop to do this, what I recommend is actually finding some really good brush presets, stuff with a lot of texture in it, so you can actually not worry about having to do that manually. And one of the best resources you can actually get is from Adobe itself. If you type in Kyle T. Webster in Google and Adobe, you will find the Kyle T. Webster brush preset packs, which you can download for free if you have an Adobe account. Now, you don't actually have to use these brushes specifically for this project, but it's a nice, easy way to get a very wide range of different kinds of texture brushes without having to really think too hard about how to find them. But you can find textured brushes for all kinds of apps like Procreate, Krita, you name it. Any app that you prefer to use, you can use it for this process. You don't actually have to use Photoshop. Photoshop for me is just the most accessible and the most well supported on the MacBook. And as you can see, as I'm scrolling through all these brush presets now, you can see that there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of brushes that you can use in Photoshop. And these are all from the Kyle brush preset pack. So you can just see how many different varieties of textures you can generate just with these brush presets. Now, once you've found the brush texture that you prefer to have for your specific kind of layout, just start brushing away. Now, of course, your project will look a lot different to mine because you're probably using a whole different kind of setting. But, if you have a specific sort of look in mind, just go ahead and try and emulate that using the right brush presets. Try and use the right colors. Use whatever's best for the mood of the shot that you're creating and just run with it. Now, there's no right or wrong way of doing this. You can do it in any way you think is best for you. I'm just going ahead and just playing it by ear, really. I knew that the whole scene I wanted to have a desert environment, obviously. I wanted to have pink flowers, and that was pretty much the gist of what I wanted for the rest of it. I also went ahead and actually rendered out a few extra passes from Blender, like a mist pass and a shadow pass, just to get an idea of the sort of structure that I was working with inside of Photoshop. So sometimes you can get a little bit lost in the depth, like how much depth is actually in your image, because you can't move it around and stuff like that. So it might be a good idea to render those out. Easy as, just switch them on in the presets, and then just render out a separate pass. Other than that, it's really just a process of just painting through the detail. Now, you may think that, oh God, this may take forever, but honestly, it actually took me more time to get the scene modeled and ready for this stage than it did for me to actually paint the stage. That's just me. But if you're comfortable painting in, say, Substance Painter or just in Photoshop in general, this should be a pretty easy endeavor. Just keep in mind that you are working with a sort of stylized approach for the most part. So depending on how realistic you're going, think about how much detail you're putting in throughout the scene. Obviously, the closer to the camera you are, the more detail you want to add. The further away from the camera different things are, the less detail you have to add. And that's the nice thing about this method as well, is that you are forced to think that way. Whereas when you're working in, say, a traditional texturing workflow, you are really tempted to put detail in every single little thing that you're creating because it's in your face every step of the way. You bring that object into Substance Painter, or you're working in Blender on that specific object, isolated from everything else, and you just add detail and detail and detail, and then you plonk it into your scene, and it's 20 meters away from the camera, and all that detail is gone. You don't even need it. You didn't even need to add that. So keep that in mind when you're painting these environments, that, the rocks in the distance, for instance, here, I'm not even really adding all that much detail. Just a few splish, splash, slop, slap details, nothing else beyond that. And then I just move on to the next stage. It's only when I come into the detail of the foreground objects that I put a little bit more consideration into, certain details, like the textures, brushes, like what kind of texture I want to add to the brush, to those plants. Do I want to add individual petals to the leaves? In this case, I couldn't be fucked, so I didn't do that. I didn't want that to be part of the look. But if you do want to go that far down the route, you would go ahead and add those to those foreground objects only, and worry less about that in the background objects. The other thing to be mindful of is just making sure that you're keeping your layer stack clean and labeled. So eventually what I like to do is make sure that every specific layer that I have is in a folder. So if I have foreground trees all complete, I have each tree in its own folder. If the ground is done, that goes into a folder in Photoshop, of course. Same with any element that you have an associated material for. That way it makes exporting out those textures, which they are essentially, out of Photoshop a lot easier. And also, as long as they're labeled, when you label your folders, it will automatically name the name of the layer in the PNG that you export, which is also really useful. So that way you don't have to worry about manually labeling everything. But yeah, once you've done that, make sure you've got everything labeled, of course, and then we just export out every single folder as individual PNG images. They can be of any resolution you need them to be. You can actually make them smaller or larger, whatever. But as long as they're in the same aspect ratio, they'll project fine. So as the painting comes to a close, what I like to do before I go ahead and export is turn on a hue saturation adjustment layer and turn down the saturation to see how the color values are looking. This is just a quick and easy way to judge whether or not there's enough contrast in your scene. And if there's enough, then you're ready to export. Okay, so here we are back in Blender, and we're ready to start to import our textures. So you can actually use any material you want to link up the textures. In this case, I can use an emission shader, but in my case, I'm actually going to use a custom toon shader, and you can use any custom toon shader for this as well. You don't have to use mine. I'm just going to open up that toon shader and replace that with this one. And as you can see, I got to turn off a few settings. Let's just turn off the rim light and all that sort of stuff. Let's bring down the shadows and the specular. All good. And now I'm ready to bring in my texture. So what I'm going to do is go to my inputs and find a texture node. So image texture node, there we are. Go to open. Let's navigate to the file. And there's my ground texture there. Open the image. And then just hook it up. Oops, wrong one. Let's go ahead and go to my Illustrator textures. There's my ground texture there. Push open image, hook it up, and Bob's your uncle. There we are. Now, you can just go ahead and make any adjustments you see fit. So if you have any lighting in your scene, you can turn on your lighting, add some shadows, that sort of thing. So for instance, here I have a shadow pass there. I can change the shadow color to get the way I want it. Try and make sure it's not too intense. And that's basically it. I can also, just to show you that this works as well with just a regular material, let's just grab a principled BSDF, hook that up, and you can see here that the same thing applies here. And you can still use things like roughness and change the specularity and that sort of stuff as well in here. So if you want to go down that route, feel free. All right, so now basically I just go through all of my materials and make sure that they're connected. So again, I have a few here that are already ready to roll. So there's my texture here, there's my material, hook it up to my output, and there we go. Hook it up to my output, there we go. And yeah, it's really, really simple. And if you look at the actual exported textures, there they are there, all individually exported with alpha channel turn on. So make sure you have alpha channels on all your exports. All right, so there we have it. As you can see, it's all looking pretty schmick. I've screwed up the camera a little bit. You can see here that we have some issues with the sky there. But I can always go ahead and just adjust that if I have to. Scale it up, for instance, and just make it fit the new camera shot. And you can just tell, like sometimes you can understand why it's really important not to screw up the camera, because you get those weird offsets. But once you're done with that, we can start to play with lighting. So let's just turn on the lighting. And here's my light. I just have a single sunlight with this one because it's an outdoor scene and it's a desert. So you can still see that we can still have shadows. You can still have highlights, all that sort of stuff. You can do all the kinds of things you'd expect in a regular setting. You can even have the camera animate. You can even have the shadows animate if you really wanted to, which is kind of cool. And you can start to add camera moves and all sort of thing as well. If you want to add a little bit of movement, in this case, I've actually just added a little bit of tree sway with a simple deform down the line here. That's how I get that little whoosh. Adding extra elements like grease pencil animation, such as these little swishes here. You can do that manually. Just draw them in. And that's how it all comes together. But yeah, the actual environment, creating that textured environment is actually pretty straightforward. All right, so that's pretty much it when it comes to this video. I hope you found it useful. I think it's a really fun method to approach your own shots. It gives it a really nice handcrafted feel to everything you make. Anyway, if you find this video useful, feel free to tag me on anything you make using these tutorials. I'd love to see it, whether you tag me on Instagram, Twitter, etc. Feel free to let me know. I'd love to see what you have in mind. If you want to download all the source files from this video, I have a Patreon account. Feel free to sign up there. As little as $3 a month, you get the working files, you get the ad-free videos, and you get Discord privileges. So you can join the Discord channel, ask questions, share your work, and join in on a monthly challenge that I will be partaking in as well. So if you're interested in that, feel free to sign up. I'd really appreciate it. It'd be a lot of fun. But yeah, I'm going to leave you guys to it. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you later and have fun. See you later. Cheers.